Hey, so I've been diving into these reports on the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and honestly, the level of U.S. involvement there is way deeper than I realized.
Oh, it's fascinating. These three are basically the poster children for pro-U.S. sentiment in Europe. It actually goes back decades because the U.S. never officially recognized them as part of the Soviet Union after 1940.
Wait, for real? So for like 50 years, the U.S. just acted like the Soviet annexation didn't happen?
Exactly. It's called the Well-Ars Declaration. When they finally got their independence back in 1991, the U.S. was right there cheering them on, and eventually helped them get into NATO and the EU in 2004.
That explains why they're so locked in with us now. But man, looking at the map, they are right on the edge. The security situation must be incredibly tense, especially since the 2022 invasion of Ukraine.
It's beyond tense. Russia's actions have basically turned the Baltics into a front line for NATO. These countries are small, their armies aren't massive, so they rely almost entirely on that NATO collective defense.
But they aren't just sitting back, right? I saw they're actually hitting their defense spending targets.
Yeah, they're one of the few groups that consistently meet the 2% of GDP target for defense. And they've been incredibly aggressive with helping Ukraine, sending javelins, stingers, you name it. Estonia and Latvia are literally at the top of the list for aid as a percentage of their GDP.
That's wild. They're outperforming much bigger economies in relative terms. And the U.S. is funneling serious cash back their way too, right?
Oh, definitely. Between 2021 and 2022, Congress put up nearly $349 million just for the Baltic Security Initiative. Plus, we've got rotational forces there now, basically U.S. troops cycling through to keep a presence.
I was reading about these hybrid threats too. It's not just about tanks on the border, is it?
No, it's much more subtle and honestly kind of scary. There's a big worry that Russia could use the ethnic Russian minorities living in those countries to manufacture a crisis.
Like a protecting our people pretext?
Exactly. A lot of those folks still get their news from Russian state media, so they're huge targets for disinformation. Because of that, the Baltics actually banned a bunch of Russian TV channels after the invasion started.
That makes sense. It's a total information war. And what about energy? They used to be totally dependent on Russian gas, didn't they?
They did. They've been sprinting away from it. Lithuania built an LNG terminal, and by the end of 2022, they all plan to be completely off Russian gas. They're basically cutting every cord they have with Moscow.
They are not messing around. But it's not just Russia. They're even picking fights with China now? I saw something about Lithuania and Taiwan.
Dude, Lithuania is being so bold. They opened a diplomatic office for Taiwan, and China lost it. They basically started a trade embargo against them. Now, all three Baltic states have quit that 17+1 group China set up for Eastern Europe.
So they're basically standing up to both giants at once. That is bold as an understatement.
It really is. They've gone from being part of the Soviet bloc to being the most vocal defenders of the Western alliance. It's a total 180 in just 30 years.
It's honestly impressive how much weight they're pulling given their size. It really shows why Congress is so focused on keeping those ties strong right now.
Totally. They're the canary in the coal mine for European security. If things go sideways there, it's a whole different world.
All right, so let's get into the Baltics. I was looking at some reports, and it's interesting. The U.S. doesn't actually do a massive amount of trade there yet, but the State Department is basically saying the door is wide open for growth.
Totally. It's relatively limited for now, but the numbers are climbing. In 2021, Lithuania actually led the pack, with U.S. exports reaching nearly $1.24 billion.
Wait, over $1 billion? What are we actually sending them?
It's a mix. A lot of used machinery, chemicals, and actually liquefied natural gas, LNG, which is huge for their energy independence. On the flip side, we're buying a lot of petroleum, furniture, and wood products from them.
Okay, so the economic ties are growing, but I feel like whenever we talk about Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the conversation always pivots to security. It feels like they're constantly looking over their shoulder at Russia.
And with good reason. For the last 20 years, they've watched Russian troop buildups and military exercises right on their borders. After the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, that anxiety just hit a whole new level.
Right, because of that whole defender of Russian speakers doctrine, right? I read that Estonia and Latvia have pretty significant ethnic Russian populations.
Exactly, about 25% in both countries. Russia often uses claims of persecution against these communities as a pretext for intervention. It's a central pillar of their foreign policy.
That sounds incredibly tense. Are people there actually expecting an invasion?
Well, the leaders say there's no immediate threat of a full-scale invasion, but they aren't taking chances. There are scenarios analysts worry about, from a quick land grab to an ambiguous invasion, like what happened in Crimea.
Wait, what about that tiny piece of Russia between Poland and Lithuania? Kaliningrad? That seems like a massive strategic headache for NATO.
Oh, it's a huge headache. It's this heavily armed exclave. Russia has S-400 missiles there, nuclear-capable Iskanders, and they even deployed hypersonic missiles recently.
So it's basically a fortress in the middle of NATO territory.
Pretty much. The big fear is the Suwalki Gap, this 100-kilometer stretch of border between Poland and Lithuania. If Russia seized that, they could basically cut the Baltic states off from the rest of NATO.
No wonder they're spending so much on defense. I saw that all three countries are actually hitting that 2% GDP target that NATO always talks about.
They are. Lithuania is actually aiming for 2.5%. They've been buying javelins, Blackhawks, and self-propelled artillery. They know they can't match Russia person for person, so they're focused on being a tripwire.
A tripwire? Like if you hit us, you're hitting all of NATO?
Exactly. NATO has these multinational battle groups stationed there. The UK leads in Estonia, Canada and Latvia, and Germany and Lithuania. The idea is to guarantee an immediate alliance-wide response.
But I heard some Baltic leaders are saying the tripwire isn't enough anymore. They want a forward defense strategy.
Yeah, the Estonian prime minister basically said the current plan would let the country be wiped off the map before help arrives. They want permanent bases and full brigades, not just these small rotational units.
That makes sense. But it's not just about tanks and boots on the ground, right? The report mentioned hybrid threats like cyber warfare and disinformation.
Oh, absolutely. Estonia basically wrote the book on this after a massive cyber attack in 2007. It actually prompted them to become world leaders in cybersecurity. They're ranked third globally now.
Third, that's impressive. And they even host NATO's Cyber Defense Center, right?
They do, and they've needed it. Just this August, Estonia repelled its largest cyber attack since 2007. It's a constant low-level war happening behind the scenes.
And then there's the energy piece. They used to be totally dependent on Russian gas, which is a huge leverage point for Moscow.
Right, but they've made moves to end that. Lithuania has this massive floating LNG terminal. Get this, it's actually named Independence.
That's not subtle at all.
Not at all, but it works. It can supply nearly 90% of the gas needs for all three Baltic countries combined. They're also working to disconnect their power grids from Russia and Belarus by 2025.
It sounds like they're systematically cutting every tie that Russia could use against them, which brings us to China. I was surprised to see they're getting skeptical of Beijing, too.
Lithuania has been the most aggressive there. They actually quit China's 17+1 trade group, calling it divisive, and then they let Taiwan open a representative office using the name Taiwan instead of Chinese Taipei.
Wow, that's a big move. China must have been furious.
They were. They hit Lithuania with a de facto trade embargo. But the Baltics seem to be shifting towards a values-based foreign policy, basically prioritizing democracy and human rights over trade deals that don't always pan out.
It's fascinating. For such small countries, they are really punching above their weight in terms of global strategy.
They have to. When you're located where they are, you don't really have the luxury of being passive.
Okay, so I was looking at this report on the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and it's wild how much is going on there right now.
It really is. They've gone from being these small regional players to basically being the front line for NATO's eastern flank.
Wait, eastern flank? Is that why the U.S. is so focused on them lately?
Exactly. The report says they are some of the strongest U.S. allies in Europe, and they basically look to Washington for leadership on almost everything security-related.
I guess that makes sense given where they are on the map, but has it always been this intense?
Well, it's always been a thing, but since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, everything changed. The urgency skyrocketed.
I noticed the report mentions members of Congress are actually traveling there now to check things out themselves.
Yeah, they're doing a lot of oversight on U.S. defense commitments. It's not just talk anymore. They're tracking actual defense sales and security assistance.
So we're essentially helping them build up their own militaries from the ground up.
In a way, yeah. Congress is pushing for more funding to bolster their capabilities so they can hold their own.
It's not just about tanks and planes, though, right? I saw something about hybrid threats. What does that even mean?
Oh, that's a huge part of it. It's the sneaky stuff. Disinformation campaigns, cyber attacks, basically trying to destabilize a country without firing a single shot.
That sounds terrifying, honestly. How do you even fight a disinformation campaign with military aid?
It's more about building resilience. The U.S. works with them on cyber defense and tracking how Russia tries to influence their public opinion.
And then there's the energy stuff. The report says they're trying to stop relying on Russian energy completely.
Right. For a long time, they were really tied to the Russian power grid and gas. Breaking that habit is a massive security move.
Wait, what was that term I saw? The 3 Cs initiative? Is that relayed?
Yes, it's this big regional project to improve energy and infrastructure. The U.S. is actually putting money into it to help European energy security.
Man, it's like a giant puzzle. Energy, cyber, tanks, everything is connected to keeping Russia at arm's length.
It really is. But there's a new piece of the puzzle that surprised me in the report. China.
Wait, China? In the Baltics? That seems a long way from home for them.
You'd be surprised. Congress is keeping a very close eye on how Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania interact with Beijing.
Is it because of trade or something? Why does the U.S. care about Baltic-China relations?
It's about influence. The U.S. is worried about China's activities across all of Europe, and the Baltics have actually been pretty bold in standing up to China lately.
So they're kind of aligned with us on the Russia front and the China front.
Exactly. They've become these key partners for U.S. policy in multiple directions. It's why Congress is so obsessed with tracking every move they make.
It sounds like a lot of work for the Congressional Research Service to keep up with all this.
Definitely. The steric mix guy who wrote the report has to track everything from military spending to energy pipelines.
It just goes to show how these 3 tiny countries are basically the epicenter of everything right now.
Totally. If you want to know what's happening with U.S. foreign policy, you kind of have to look at what's happening in the Baltics.
Okay, so I was diving into this research on post-communist Europe, and I keep seeing this word lustration. What is that even about?
Oh, it's actually a fascinating term. It literally comes from an ancient Latin ritual called lustratio, which was about cleansing newborns of evil spirits.
Wait, so they were basically trying to cleanse the government of the old regime?
Exactly. In the jargon of the Czechoslovak secret police, it just meant checking someone's records. But after 1989, it became this whole process of vetting officials to see if they'd been secret informers.
That sounds intense. Like, how many people are we talking about here? It couldn't have been that many, right?
Actually, it was massive. In Poland alone, there were about 80,000 registered secret collaborators by the end of the communist era.
80,000? No way. Why so many?
Well, the regimes wanted total control. They targeted everyone: priests, intellectuals, students, factory workers. It was a systematic, bureaucratized network.
It's wild because you think people would just know who the informers were, but they kept these crazy detailed files, right?
Oh, the paperwork was incredible. They even kept records on the owners of the apartments where the secret meetings took place. Everything was documented.
That's terrifying. But okay, if there were so many files, didn't it make it easy to figure out who was who once the system collapsed?
You'd think so, but it turned out to be a total political nightmare. Take Lech Walesa, for example. I mean, the guy was a Nobel Peace Prize winner and the face of the revolution.
Right, he was the hero of solidarity. Don't tell me he was on those lists.
Well, there were rumors for years that he was an informer with the codename Bullock. He always denied it, and a court even cleared him in 2000 because they didn't have the evidence.
So it was just a smear campaign?
Not quite. In 2016, prosecutors went to the villa of the widow of General Kiszczak. He was the former interior minister, and they found boxes of original files.
Wait, they were just sitting in his house?
Pretty much. It was hundreds of pages of files and even handwritten receipts for money. Graphologists confirmed it was Walens's handwriting.
That is insane. So the guy who helped bring down communism was once working for the secret police?
Yeah, between 1970 and 1976, most historians now agree he was Bolek, even though he still denies it to this day.
That sounds like a recipe for a lot of awkward dinner parties.
To say the least. But then you have places like Czechoslovakia, where they went even further. Their law didn't just target informers, it banned high-level Communist Party functionaries from government jobs, too.
Wait, so even if you weren't a party member, just being a party member could get you banned?
Exactly. They called it decommunization. It was much more radical. It actually caused a lot of tension between the Czechs and the Slovaks, which helped lead to their velvet divorce.
I didn't realize lustration played a role in the country splitting up. That's huge.
It really did. Meanwhile, in Romania, the whole thing was different because their revolution was so violent.
Right, they executed the Ceausescus.
Exactly. But after that, the people who took over were often former communists themselves, like President Ion Iliescu, so they didn't really push for lustration laws at all.
So they just skipped it?
Mostly. It was more about revolutionary justice in the moment than any systematic legal process later on.
It feels like there's no perfect way to do this. You either dig up all these secrets and cause chaos, or you ignore it and let the old guard stay in power.
That's the core dilemma of transitional justice. Do you punish people to get closure, or do you forgive them to encourage reconciliation?
And I guess it's even harder when the system is moving from a nationalized economy to a free market at the same time. Everything is changing at once.
Exactly. It wasn't just political. It was a total societal overhaul. And if those former informers ended up in power during the privatization of the economy, it just fueled more resentment.
It's interesting that the author mentioned Yugoslavia didn't really do this either. Why was that?
Well, because they were literally in the middle of bloody ethnic wars. The trauma of the war in the 90s totally overshadowed any memory of communist-era wrongdoing.
That makes sense. If your house is on fire, you're not worrying about who looked at your secret police file 20 years ago.
Right. And then you have the Baltic states like Estonia and Latvia, who had it even tougher because the KGB moved most of their archives to Russia before they could get their hands on them.
So they had the laws, but no evidence.
Mostly, yeah. They made people take an oath of conscience where they had to swear they weren't involved with the KGB, but it was hard to verify.
It really shows that lustration wasn't just a legal thing. It was this deep moral struggle for these new democracies to find their footing.
Totally. It's about how a society chooses to remember its past while trying to build a future. It's never as clean as people want it to be.
All right, so next topic, we're looking at the early 90s. And man, things got messy with this lustration stuff fast.
Oh, completely. It basically went from this careful legal process to total chaos. In the Czech lands, for example, there was this guy, Peter Cibulka.
Wait, I remember him. He's the one who leaked that massive list, right?
Yeah, exactly. He published a list of about 220,000 names. Informers, candidates, secret police functionaries. It just leaked from the Ministry of Internal Affairs.
220,000? That's insane. Before that, weren't they trying to be all discreet about it, like in Germany, where they'd black out names to protect privacy?
Totally. Germany's Gauck office was much more careful, but Cibulka just blew the lid off the whole privacy thing. It made people realize how prickly the whole opening the archives issue really was.
And it wasn't just the Czechs. Poland had that huge La File affair in '92, too. I was reading that the Minister of Internal Affairs, Macierewicz, basically delivered a list of 64 names in envelopes to Parliament.
And it was a disaster. It caused such political turmoil that the entire government was dismissed. They even had secret files on President Lech Walesa.
No way. So they were using these secret police files as actual weapons in political battles?
Precisely. They called it wild lustration. It wasn't about justice anymore. It was about taking down your rivals. Walesa was being called Bolek, while his opponents were being outed with code names like cigarette lighter.
Cigarette lighter? That sounds like a bad spy movie. But seriously, it sounds like it just paralyzed the government.
It did. In Poland, the post-communist parties actually won the next election in '93, partly because people were so tired of the chaos. They ended up slowing the whole process down.
I guess that makes sense. But what about the rest of the world? Was anyone watching this happen and thinking, hey, maybe we should set some ground rules?
Well, the international community was definitely caught off guard. The Western press was generally pretty liberal, so they were more worried about human rights and individual privacy than cleansing the state.
So they were basically siding with the people who wanted to stop the lustration.
In a way, yeah. They saw it as potentially discriminatory. The Council of Europe actually spent 4 years working on a resolution about it.
4 years? That's a long time to sit on the sidelines while governments are toppling.
Right? They finally passed Resolution 1096 in 1996. It basically said, look, lustration is okay to protect democracy, but you have to follow the rule of law. No using it for political revenge.
Did anyone actually listen to those guidelines?
Sort of. Poland eventually passed a new law in 1997 that was actually really interesting. Instead of punishing you for being an informer, they only punished you if you lied about it.
Wait, back up. So if I was a spy and I admitted it, I could keep my job?
Well, it would be published in the official gazette and on your election posters, so the voters could decide. But the lustration lie was what got you banned from office for 10 years.
That's a fascinating loophole. Honesty is the best policy, even for former spies.
Exactly. Now, compare that to some of the Balkan states. In places like Croatia and Slovenia, they basically rejected lustration laws altogether.
Why? Was it because of the wars there?
Exactly. They were more focused on ethnic issues. In Croatia, there was this belief that it was the Serbs who committed the crimes, not the Croats. So they didn't see a need for a general lustration.
Oh, so it was more about anti-corruption and cleansing the recent government than dealing with the distant past.
Exactly. They even tied it to property declarations. If you couldn't prove how you got your money while in office, you were out. It's like lustration evolved into a tool for modern accountability.
It's wild how it started as this way to handle the Cold War legacy and turned into something else entirely, depending on where you were.
Totally. In Russia, it never even got off the ground. Galina Starowaitova tried to bring a bill to the Duma in '92, but they wouldn't even put it on the agenda.
And we know how that ended. No lustration, and, well, the rest is history.
Okay, so I was looking into this whole thing about how countries deal with their past after a dictatorship falls. It's wild. They call it lustration, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's basically a fancy term for vetting people in public office to see if they were secret police informers back in the communist days.
Right, but it wasn't just a simple check the records and fire them situation. It sounds like every country did it totally differently.
Totally. And the experts can't even agree on why. Like Samuel Huntington, the third wave guy, he thought it would happen fastest in places with violent revolutions, like Romania.
Wait, did it? Because I feel like I read that Romania actually blocked a lot of this early on.
Exactly. Huntington was way off. He was basing his ideas on South America, not Europe. In reality, in places like Romania and Bulgaria, the post-communist parties were strong enough to just stop the process.
So they basically said, nothing to see here, let's just move on.
Pretty much. Then you have guys like John Moran, who argued that if the old regime was harsh, the cleanup would be radical. But then you look at Czechoslovakia, very harsh regime, but they actually suspended the process for a while in Slovakia.
So it's not about how bad the old guys were. It's about who's in charge now.
That's what Helga Welsh argued in the mid-90s. She said it's all about current politics. If the post-communist party is weak, it's easier to purge the system.
That makes sense. It's like a political weapon. If I want to get rid of my opponent, I just find a file that says they talked to the secret police in 1982.
Yes, and that's exactly what some researchers found. Lustration became a tool in a political game. It wasn't just about justice. It was about winning elections.
But hold on, there's this one theory mentioned, something about skeletons in the closet. That sounds like a thriller novel.
It's a real theory by Monika Nalepa. She used game theory to argue that large opposition movements, like in Poland, were actually more likely to be infiltrated by spies than small ones.
Wait, really? So the bigger the movement, the more skeletons they had?
Right, because it's harder to vet everyone. So she argues that some of these new leaders actually opposed lustration because they knew they had informers in their own ranks.
That is so cynical, but also kind of genius.
It's intense. And then Roman David adds this other layer, the gray zone. He says people who weren't victims or villains but just complied with the system often became the loudest supporters of lustration.
No way. Why? Like to prove they weren't the bad guy?
Exactly. They point fingers at others to hide their own past weaknesses. It's a huge psychological mess.
I also noticed there's a difference between confession-based and accusation-based systems. Like in Poland, you have to tell on yourself?
Yeah, it's wild. In Poland and Hungary, you basically submit a declaration. If you admit you collaborated, you might stay on your job. But if you lie and they find out, then you're in trouble. They call it a lustration lie.
A lustration lie? That sounds like something out of a courtroom drama.
It really is. Whereas in the Czech Republic, it's exclusionary. If the files say you were an informer, you're just out. Period. No confession needed.
But what about the files themselves? Can we even trust them? I mean, these were the secret police. They could have faked everything.
That's the big legal dilemma. These laws are trying to be democratic, but they're based on evidence created by a non-democratic system. It's why constitutional courts in places like Hungary and Poland were constantly acting as brakes.
I bet that made people furious. Imagine knowing someone was a spy and the court lets them off on a technicality.
Oh, it led to wild lustration. Basically, people would get into the archives, find out their neighbor or a famous actor was an informer, and just leak it to the press.
That is so messy. Everyone just digging up dirt on each other.
It really changed the whole culture. They even talk about a Judas complex, this deep emotional trauma of finding out a close friend was the one reporting on you.
Man, that's heavy. Is this still going on today, or has it mostly finished?
Well, the famous Gauck office in Germany actually closed in 2021, so in some ways it's becoming history. But in places like Ukraine or Georgia, they had a late wave of lustration recently.
So it's not just a 90s thing. It's a permanent tool for whenever a regime changes.
Exactly. It's this endless continuum of collective and individual responsibility.
Okay, so I was reading about Estonia's economic transition, and it kind of turns the usual advice on its head.
Right? The standard academic view is always institutions first. You need the rules, the courts, and the agencies before you even think about radical reform.
Exactly. Like you can't have a game without a referee, right?
But the authors here, Abrams and Fish, argue that Estonia basically just started playing anyway.
Exactly. They say that in Estonia, the good institutions, those well-enforced rules everyone talks about, were actually a result of the policies, not the cause of them.
Wait, hold on. Let's back up. How do they define the difference? Because people use the word institution for everything.
Good point. They follow John Kerry's definition of parchment institutions. Basically just the formal rules, laws and regulations on paper.
And policies?
Policies are the actual actions the government takes to solve a problem. It's the difference between having a law against subsidies and actually, stopping the checks.
Okay, that makes sense. So Estonia starts off after the Soviet collapse, and they've got nothing. No market rules, no property rights, just chaos?
Pretty much, but they had this revolutionary counter-elite led by Mart Laar, who came to power in 1992. These guys were ideological. They weren't part of the old communist nomenclatura.
So they weren't trying to protect the old system?
Not at all. Their big move, and this is the core of the whole thing, was imposing what they call hard budget constraints, or HBCs.
I've heard that term. Is that just like, don't spend more than you have?
Well, it's more specific. In a soft budget environment, if a company is failing, the government just bails them out, or gives them a special tax break, or a soft loan from a state bank.
Oh, so it's like a safety net for crumbs.
Exactly. Abrams and Fish call these people political capitalists. They don't win because they're good at business. They win because they know the guy in charge.
So Estonia just cut them off?
Cold turkey. It was wild. While other countries like the Czech Republic were hesitating, Estonia's government actually started shutting down insolvent state banks.
Wait, they actually let the big banks fail? No too big to fail?
No. In 1992, they put a moratorium on the 3 biggest state banks. They closed one, merged the others, and told everyone else, no more bailouts.
That must have been a disaster for the people involved.
It was a shock. The material says the banks assumed the government would cover the debts of state enterprises. When they didn't, the banks suddenly had to actually be careful about who they lent money to.
So by cutting off the money, they basically forced people to become real entrepreneurs instead of just beggars for state funds.
Exactly. It sidelined the political capitalists. If you couldn't make a profit, you went bankrupt, period. They even brought in a flat tax to stop people from lobbying for special exemptions.
That's fascinating because it means they didn't wait for a perfect legal system. They used the policy of no more free money to clear the field.
Right. And once the field was cleared of these powerful, corrupt actors, there was no one left to fight against the good rules.
Oh, I see. If you have powerful cronies, they'll lobby against fair laws because they like the mess.
Exactly. You can't build a fair court if the most powerful people in the country want to bribe the judges. But in Estonia, the most powerful people became the real entrepreneurs.
The paper mentions China too, right? Saying they did something similar.
Yeah, it's a great comparison. Deng Xiaoping turned to the market in 1978, long before China had savvy technocrats or sophisticated agencies. The growth came first, then the rules.
It's so counterintuitive. We're always told you need the institutional infrastructure first.
Well, Abrams and Fish argue that institutions are more like knock-on effects. You get the policies right, you purge the corruption by hardening the budget, and the institutions will follow.
So what happened to the old red directors? The guys running the Soviet-era factories?
Most of them failed. There's a quote from an investigative journalist in there saying they had the inside knowledge to privatize the companies, but they didn't actually know how to run them in a real market.
And since there were no bailouts,
they went under. Younger, smarter people who understood modern business took over.
It's a tough love approach to nation building, honestly.
It really is. And it required a government willing to sacrifice their own political survival for the reform. Laar's party was okay with losing the next election if it meant the reform stuck.
That's a huge point. It wasn't just good ideas, it was ideological commitment.
Totally. They weren't just following a Western manual. They were doing what they believed was necessary for sovereignty and change.
I'm looking at this table of non-performing loans. Estonia's numbers are crazy low compared to like Lithuania or Poland in the 90s.
Right? By the late 90s, they were at like 1 or 2%, while some neighbors were still struggling with 20 or 30% bad loans. That's the HBC policy in action.
So the takeaway is stop the subsidies, let the failures happen, and you actually end up with a cleaner system where you can build those good rules.
Precisely. Policies first, institutions second.
All right, so I was looking into this whole post-Soviet transition thing, and Estonia really stands out. Like, they didn't just survive, they kind of crushed it. What was their secret?
It's actually wild. Most of it comes down to what economists call hard budget constraints, or HBCs. Basically, they cut off the lifeblood for political capitalists. You know, the guys who get rich just by knowing the right people in government.
Wait, back up. Political capitalists? That sounds like a fancy way of saying cronies.
Exactly. In most post-communist countries, these guys would just loot state assets. But Estonia's government basically said no more handouts. If your company fails, it fails. You're not getting a state bailout.
So they basically forced everyone to actually be good at business.
Pretty much. It's why the red directors, those old-school Soviet managers, mostly didn't make it to the top. One guy, Ryan Karapere, tried to start a bank using his Communist Party connections, but it failed and got shut down. The rules were just different there.
So who actually became the rich people in Estonia then, if it wasn't the old guard?
Real entrepreneurs, people like Matti Pauli and Peter Mand. They built a timber empire called Sylvester from the ground up without relying on political favors. They eventually sold it to a Finnish investor for a ton of money.
That's cool, but how did they even build a government that could say no to the cronies? Like, who was running the show?
This is the best part. It was like this stealthy, insurgent state building. They had these reformers like Edgar Savisaar and Raivo Vare who literally created parallel ministries to make the old Soviet ones irrelevant.
Wait, are you serious? They just built a second government next to the first one?
Yeah, they took over the Estonian branch of Gosplan, the Soviet planning agency, and then just started building new agencies from scratch. They called the state chancellery an incubator for new ideas.
That sounds like something out of a spy movie. The Incubator.
Right? And the people they hired were incredibly young. Avo Kak, who ran the taxation department in the Ministry of Finance, was 27 when he started. And he was one of the older guys.
27? I was still trying to figure out how to do my laundry at 27. How did they know how to run a finance ministry?
They didn't. Kak admitted he had zero tax background. None of his staff had studied it. They literally had to learn on the job as they were building the system.
That is terrifying, but also kind of inspiring.
It worked because they weren't tied to the old ways. Now, the courts and police were a different story. Those took longer to change because they inherited the whole Soviet system intact.
I bet. You can't just innovate a judicial system over a weekend.
No way. Judges had to be retrained from scratch. They actually brought in experts from Germany to teach them about contract law and corporate litigation, stuff that just didn't exist in the Soviet era.
So you have these young, inexperienced people running things. Why didn't they just get corrupted by the first billionaire who walked in the door?
That's the beauty of those hard budget constraints we talked about. Because the government wasn't handing out subsidies or soft loans, there was nothing for the predators to hunt. The lifeblood of political capitalism was gone.
So it's not that Estonians are magically more honest, it's that the system made it hard to be a cheat.
Exactly. And they kept tightening the screws. By 2012, they updated their Anti-Corruption Act to have an open definition of a public official. Basically, if you make decisions for the state, you're covered by the rules. No loopholes.
I love that. No loopholes. But what about the neighborhood? They're right next to Russia. That's a lot of dirty money moving around.
Dude, Estonia's anti-money laundering rules are actually stricter than EU standards because they know the risk. Like, financial institutions there have to meet every first-time client face-to-face. No anonymous shell company accounts.
Contrast that with some of their neighbors.
Right. Look at Latvia or Cyprus. They became hubs for illicit Russian capital. Estonia's senior specialist, Veronika Metz, said that if their laws weren't so strict, they would have ended up just like them.
It's crazy how much those early decisions in the 90s still matter today.
It really does. In 2014, Estonia was ranked 26th in the world for low corruption. They're tied with France. Meanwhile, Russia was way down at 136th.
France? Wow, that's a long way from the Soviet Union.
It really shows that if you cut off the rent seekers early and build the bureaucracy from scratch with the right rules, you can actually change the DNA of a country's economy.
All right, so next topic. I was just looking at this study comparing how different countries handled the transition after communism. It's wild how differently things went for Estonia compared to, say, Ukraine.
Oh, it's night and day. The study basically argues that Estonia pulled off this incredible transformation because they were willing to be ruthless about money in a way others weren't.
Ruthless how? Like just cutting people off?
Exactly. They implemented what the authors call hard budget constraints. In Ukraine, it was the exact opposite. They had soft budget constraints, which is basically a fancy way of saying the government just kept printing money for their friends.
So here's a pile of cash because we're Benz?
Pretty much. The central bank in Ukraine was just unleashing tides of easy money, and the elites actually set up these things called pocket banks, specifically to catch that soft financing.
Wait, pocket banks? That sounds like something out of a heist movie.
Right? They weren't real banks, they were just funnels. And if you weren't connected, you weren't getting anything. It created this class of political capitalists who only existed because of state favors.
And this actually shows up in the numbers, right? I saw a table in the material about plutocrats.
Oh, the stats are insane. In Ukraine, between 83 and 98% of the richest people, the plutocrats, gained their fortunes through political connections. In Estonia, that number is roughly half.
Wait, half is still a lot, but 98%? That's basically everyone at the top.
It's total capture, and it leads to this thing called criminal corporate raiding. In Ukraine, nearly half of the top plutocrats have allegedly been involved in at least one illegal takeover of the business.
Like, actually stealing companies? How does that even work if there's a court system?
That's the crazy part. The material talks about how in places like Poland and Ukraine, these raiders actually use the state. They use corrupt judges, police, and even tax officials to bankrupt a target through false prosecutions.
Whoa, so they have professional-looking agencies, but they're just not effective?
Exactly. The authors say you can have a few honest state bodies, but they're just picking up the pieces while corrupt business people conspire with prosecutors. It's a mess.
So why is Estonia different? Did they just happen to have more honest people?
Not just luck, they did a systematic vetting process. They literally filtered out officials who were politically compromised or incompetent. They cleaned house.
But they also use that hard budget thing you mentioned. How does that stop a corrupt judge?
Because if you cut off the easy money, the subsidies, the cheap loans, the tax breaks, you starve the predatory species. Without that state cash, the political capitalists can't afford to buy the judges in the first place.
It's like a Darwinian struggle for the economy.
That is literally the analogy the authors use. They compare the usual advice to build institutions to Lamarckian evolution. You know, the idea that giraffes got long necks just by trying really hard to reach the trees.
Right, like if we just will a court system into existence, it'll work.
Exactly. But the authors say it's Darwinian. You have to marginalize the predators first by taking away their food source, the soft budget constraints, before the good institutions have any chance to grow.
That's a huge shift in how to think about reform. I mean, even someone like Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel winner, argued for a more gradual approach, right?
Yeah, Stiglitz thought you needed to build the regulatory framework before you privatized everything. But these authors say he has the causal arrows reversed.
Reversed? How so?
They're saying you can't build those rules as long as the economy is dominated by people whose fortunes depend on political favors. They will literally sabotage any law that makes things fair.
So if you wait and go slow, you're just giving the predators more time to entrench themselves.
Precisely. Speed is of the essence. In Estonia, they did shock therapy, and it worked because it hit the budding criminal networks before they could capture the state.
It sounds like a winter is coming situation for corrupt business guys. You just have to make the winter long enough to thin the herd.
A long winter of hard budget constraints. I love that. And the study says even now, it's the best hope for countries like Ukraine or Russia, even if the criminals are already well-rooted.
It's a tough sell politically, though. Who wants to be the politician that cuts off all the subsidies?
It's incredibly hard. Most governments in Poland and Ukraine end up foundering under corrupt enticements. But the Estonian case proves that if you're fast and comprehensive, you can actually come out the other side with one of the most transparent states in the world.
Okay, so I was looking into this thing called the 3 Cs initiative, and honestly, it sounds like something straight out of a geopolitical thriller.
It kind of is. It's this massive project between the Adriatic, Baltic, and Black Seas, involving 12 EU countries.
Right, like Poland, Croatia, Romania. Basically a giant vertical slice of Europe. But why focus on those 3 Cs specifically?
Well, the main goal is to fix a huge infrastructure gap. If you look at the map, the east-west connections are actually pretty solid, but moving north to south is a nightmare.
Wait, why is that? You'd think they'd have that figured out by now.
It's a total hangover from the Cold War. When the Soviet Union dominated the region, they built everything to point toward Moscow. North-south links just weren't a priority.
Ah, that makes sense. So they're literally still living with the physical layout of the Iron Curtain.
Exactly. And it's not just roads. Energy is the huge one. Most of their pipelines run east-west, which means they've been stuck being way too dependent on Russia for gas.
And that's exactly what the U.S. and these countries are worried about, right? Like with those Nord Stream 2 and Turk Stream pipelines.
Precisely. The 3Cs initiative, or 3SI, is trying to flip the script by building new routes for alternative suppliers, like using liquefied natural gas terminals.
I saw something about an LNG terminal in Croatia at a place called Kirk.
Yep, that was a big win. They finished it in late 2020. It connects through Hungary and Slovakia, which is a massive step for energy independence.
It's wild that travel in that region takes like 2 to 4 times longer than the rest of the EU. Is that actually true?
Sadly, yeah. The data shows that rail and road travel is significantly slower there. It's a huge drag on their economy.
That's crazy because these countries make up almost 30% of EU territory, but only 10% of the total GDP.
Right, they have 22% of the population, but only a fraction of the wealth. They're trying to bridge that gap by getting private investment into these 48 priority projects.
48? That's a lot of construction. What else are they building besides pipelines?
They've got the Viking train, which is supposed to link the Baltic and Black Seas through Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine.
Viking train sounds incredibly cool. But wait, I also saw something called the Digital Highway.
Yeah, it's not just physical roads. They're looking at 5G and fiber optics to boost data transfer across the whole region.
So it's energy, transport, and digital. It's like a total regional reboot.
It really is, and the U.S. is surprisingly all in on this. I mean, it's actually bipartisan, which you don't see every day.
I noticed that. Both the Trump and Biden administrations backed it. Why is the U.S. so invested in Eastern European infrastructure?
2 words, Russia and China. The U.S. wants to deter Russian influence through energy security and counterbalance China's Belt and Road investments in the area.
Oh, so it's like a countermove to the Belt and Road Initiative. I didn't think of it that way.
Definitely. And the U.S. actually put money on the table. The International Development Finance Corporation approved $300 million specifically for 3SI energy projects.
Wait, $300 million is a lot, but didn't they pledge up to $1 billion at one point?
They did. There's been a lot of push from Congress to make sure that full support actually happens to keep those countries from relying on China or Russia.
And what about the EU itself? Are they just watching from the sidelines?
Actually, no. The EU has put over 150 billion euros into these countries recently, and a huge chunk of that was for these exact types of connectivity projects.
It seems like everyone is racing to get this infrastructure built. It's like a new great game, but with fiber optics and gas terminals.
That's a great way to put it. They even have an investment fund trying to raise up to 5 billion euros from private investors and development banks.
So let's talk about the Brewer pipeline. That's another one on the list, right?
Right. That one connects Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, and Austria. It's meant to move gas from the Romanian Black Sea into the rest of the region.
It really feels like they are building a wall of infrastructure to protect their independence.
That's the vision. If you have your own energy and your own high-speed connections, you're a lot harder to manipulate.
All right, so I was diving into this paper by Samuel Charap and Mikhail Troitskiy, and they've got this fascinating take on what's actually happening between Russia and the West. It's not just about tanks or spies anymore.
Right. It's about what they call the integration dilemma. It's like the old-school security dilemma, but updated for trade deals and alliances.
Wait, back up. The security dilemma. That's that Robert Jervis thing, right? Where one country tries to feel safe and it accidentally makes everyone else terrified?
Exactly. Jervis says states often do things to bolster security that are unintended and unforeseen, which then makes other states feel less secure. It's this tragic spiral where everyone wants security, but their actions push it further away.
So applying that to integration, basically, if I join a club and you're not invited, you're going to think that club is a threat to you.
Exactly. The paper defines it as a state perceiving its neighbors joining exclusive military or economic groups as a threat to its own security or prosperity. Because it's closed, it turns a positive-sum process into a zero-sum game.
So even if the club, say NATO or the EU, isn't actually trying to be hostile, Russia sees it as a move against them because they're on the outside looking in.
Precisely. And once you start making those worst-case assumptions about motives, things escalate fast. It's a costly cycle of action and reaction with almost no communication.
And this all really kicked off with NATO enlargement in the 90s, didn't it?
Yeah, that was the first big manifestation. The authors point out that while NATO had an open-door policy, it was basically a formality for Russia. Both sides knew Russia joining was super unlikely because of trust and interoperability issues.
But NATO always says, hey, we're a defensive alliance. Why are you so worried?
Right. And Jervis actually predicted that. He said the inability to recognize that your own actions look menacing is a huge part of the problem. NATO thinks it's providing stability, but Moscow sees it as a hedge against them.
So Russia responds by building its own club, the CSTO, and then NATO calls it a paper tiger and refuses to talk to them. It's like a middle school drama, but with nukes.
It really is. And the paper argues this moved from military stuff into the economic sphere with the EU's Eastern Partnership in 2009.
Wait, the EAP? That was specifically for those 6 countries like Ukraine and Georgia, right?
Yeah, and the authors note there was no real criteria for picking them, other than all but Russia. It excluded Russia from the start.
And these association agreements, they weren't just simple trade deals, right? They were asking these countries to basically rewrite their laws to match the EU.
Exactly, the acquis communautaire. It integrates them into the EU's legal space and, crucially, diverts trade away from Russia. For a country like Ukraine, which has huge trade ties with Russia, that's a massive deal.
No wonder Moscow freaked out. They saw it as a threat to their economic security, regardless of what the EU intended.
Totally. So Russia pushes its own version, the customs union, which eventually becomes the Eurasian Economic Union. They even started talking about a shared currency.
Seriously? A shared currency? That's a huge step toward becoming a real rival bloc.
It is, and then you get these tug-of-war moments. Like Armenia, they were all set to sign with the EU, and then suddenly, after a meeting with Putin in 2013, they pivot 180 degrees to the customs union.
That's wild. And Ukraine was the biggest prize in this game, right? Russia was basically stalling their exports to send a message.
Yeah, Moscow applied the full letter of customs rules to Ukrainian goods, which basically brought trade to a halt. It was a very loud, very clear warning about what would happen if they signed with the EU.
And the EU's response is just, why can't you guys see that this is good for you?
Exactly. Stefan Füle, the EU commissioner, was basically saying, we just need to communicate better that this isn't against you. The authors call this outcome overdetermined. Like, of course it ended in a clash.
The tragedy is that the countries in the middle, Ukraine, Moldova, are the ones paying the price while the big powers play this great game.
That's the real cost. Instead of helping these states with decaying infrastructure or corruption, the EU, the US, and Russia are stuck in this escalatory spiral. It even forces the EU to compromise its own standards.
Wait, how so?
Well, they were so afraid of losing Ukraine to Russia that they started easing up on the Copenhagen criteria. You know, democracy and human rights, just to get the deal done.
So they're sacrificing their principles because they're in a winner-take-all mindset. That seems super short-sighted.
It is. The authors argue that these deals won't be sustainable if they're forced through with haste and pressure. I mean, look at those 2009 gas deals between Russia and Ukraine. They were hailed as a breakthrough and then ruled a criminal act 3 years later.
So what's the fix? Is there any way to make these two systems, talk to each other?
Charap and Troitskiy say they aren't inherently incompatible. Both are WTO compliant. They suggest the U.S. does this all the time, negotiating different trade blocs like TTIP and TPP simultaneously without it being a zero-sum crisis.
So the incompatibility is by design. We chose to make them rivals.
Exactly. They suggest starting with a serious dialogue and a joint assessment of how these trade deals actually impact each other. Use flexible diplomacy instead of just trying to win the region.
It's about moving past that Cold War narrative where every trade deal is a battle for a country's soul.
Right, because if we don't overcome this zero-sum logic, we're just stuck in a senseless regional great game while the actual people in those countries continue to suffer.
So I was just looking into this report on the Baltic Sea, and things are moving fast, like really fast. It's calling the whole situation a sea change.
Yeah, sea change is putting it mildly. We're talking about the biggest shift in European security architecture in decades, all because the Baltic Sea is basically becoming a NATO lake.
Wait, NATO lake? That sounds intense. Is that actually how the military planners are looking at it now?
Totally. With Finland in and Sweden on the verge, Russia's access to the Baltic is suddenly incredibly constrained. Their Kaliningrad exclave? The report says it's basically a hostage now if things go south.
A hostage? Wow. But, okay, back up a second. This whole shift started because of the invasion of Ukraine, right? Like, that was the wake-up call.
Exactly. For countries like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, it wasn't just a wake-up call. It was a confirmation of their worst nightmares. They have no strategic depth. I mean, the amount of territory Russia took in the first months of the war is more than the land area of all 3 Baltic states combined.
That's terrifying. No wonder they're saying not 1 inch, not 1 soul can fall under Russian control.
Right. And for a long time, the region was, as the report puts it, strategically incoherent because Finland and Sweden weren't in NATO. It made planning a total mess.
So now that they're joining, everything is fixed? Problem solved?
I wish. The report is pretty blunt. Time is alarmingly short. They think Russia could reconstitute its forces enough to threaten the Baltics again in less than 5 years.
5 years? That's tomorrow in military terms. Are they actually ready for that?
Well, they're trying to be, but everyone's starting from different places. Take Sweden. The report mentions this term fredsskadad, which means peace damaged.
Peace damaged? Like they're so used to being at peace they forgot how to prepare for war.
Exactly. They dismantled their total defense model after the Cold War. Now they're scrambling to bring back conscription and reach a 90,000-strong force by 2030.
But Finland is different, right? I always hear they're the ones who never stop preparing.
Oh, Finland is the gold standard. They never drop their guard. For a country of 5.5 million, they can mobilize a field army of 280,000. That's one of the largest ground forces in Europe.
That's wild. And they're buying F-35s too, right?
Yeah, 64 of them. They're spending billions on everything from fighter jets to the David Sling defense system. They're not messing around.
What about Poland? I saw they were called the military heavyweight of the region.
Oh, Poland is going massive. They're aiming to spend 4% of their GDP on defense. We're talking 1,000 tanks, hundreds of HIMARS. They basically want to build the most significant military power in Europe to buffer against Russia.
It sounds like a massive arms race, but the report also talks about things that aren't just tanks and planes, like non-military resilience.
That's actually the secret sauce. If you have a society that's hard to break, war is less likely. Finland has these national defense courses where CEOs, politicians, and church leaders all train together on how to handle a crisis.
So it's like a networking event, but for the end of the world?
Pretty much. It builds this high level of societal trust. Plus, they have shelters that can fit 86% of the population.
86%? That's incredible. But wait, what about the islands? I saw something about Gotland being a big deal.
Gotland is huge. It's this Swedish island in the middle of the Baltic. If you control Gotland, you can basically block any Russian naval strike force and support NATO airlift into the Baltics. It's our logistic hub.
But the report says the defenses there were also the smack of.
Yeah, in the 90s. They're rebuilding now, but it's a substantial task. They need at least a full brigade there to protect the airfields and harbors.
It feels like a giant jigsaw puzzle where all the pieces are finally being pushed together. But what about the gray zone stuff, like cyber attacks?
The Baltics are the experts there. Estonia got hit by a massive Russian cyber attack back in 2007, and it basically turned them into the world's leading cyber defense hub. They even have these volunteer elves in Lithuania who fight pro-Kremlin propaganda online.
Elves fighting trolls? I love that. So what's the bottom line? Is the sea change enough to keep the peace?
The report says it's feasible, but the cost, both political and economic, is going to be huge. They need better plans, more weapons, and they need to overcome historical divisions. Basically, they have to act like one single integrated defense force.
And they have less than 5 years to get it perfect. No pressure, right?
Exactly. Just a complete overhaul of the regional security architecture in a few years. No big deal.
All right, so it sounds like the NATO lake is the goal, but we're still in the middle of a very choppy transition.
Definitely. But as the report says, getting this right could be a template for other NATO regions, like the Black Sea. It's about collective resilience.
Yeah, let's hope they can move fast enough. This was fascinating. Thanks for breaking it down.
Anytime. It's a wild time for the region.
All right, so I was diving into this report on Nordic-Baltic security, and I have to ask, did you hear about that massive raid in Finland back in 2018?
Oh, the Ariston-Helmi case? It sounds like something straight out of a spy novel, right? 400 officials, special forces, even military police, all descending on this small real estate company.
Wait, 400 people for a real estate firm? That's insane. What were they actually doing?
Well, they were buying up land right next to strategic military sites and underwater cables. When the authorities finally moved in, they found millions in cash, bunkers, and even decommissioned naval vessels still in their original camouflage.
No way. Camouflaged warships just sitting there? The report says the owner was a Russian-born millionaire with a Maltese passport, right?
Exactly, Pavel Melnikov. He denies any link to the Russian state, but a military historian in the report suggests the whole thing was likely a front for Russian intelligence to potentially sabotage communications during a crisis.
That is terrifying. It really highlights why the report calls this a sea change in the region. It's not just about traditional war anymore.
Totally. It's about resilience. Finland is actually the gold standard here with their comprehensive security model. They involve every part of society, not just the military.
Right, but the report mentions they might have waited too long to act on that specific company. It says they were tight-lipped for 5 years.
True, but when they did act, it was decisive. The message was, we see you and we won't allow this. Now the big push is to get the whole Nordic-Baltic region on that same page.
Is that even possible? I mean, you've got Poland, the Baltics, the Nordics. They all have different histories with Russia.
It's a huge challenge. The report basically says they need to pool their sovereignty. Like, no one country can handle this alone, so they have to trust each other with military command.
Speaking of trust, I noticed they're recommending an annual regional threat assessment that names names, like actually calling out specific companies or officials involved in subversion.
Yeah, they want to use the Estonian Kapo model. Estonia's internal security service has been publishing these blunt annual reviews since the late 90s. It's all about taking away the adversary's shadow.
I love that, naming and shaming as a security strategy. But what about the physical stuff? I was surprised to read how bad the rail connections are between these countries.
It's a mess. The report points out that the Baltics don't even have a direct rail connection to the rest of Europe yet. They're working on Rail Baltica, but it's years behind schedule.
So if something happened, they couldn't even move equipment quickly? That seems like a pretty big hole in the deterrence plan.
Exactly. That's why they're pushing for military mobility. They need bridges and ports that can actually handle heavy tanks, not just tourist traffic.
And then there's the money. The report says the 2% of GDP target for NATO spending should be the floor, not the ceiling.
Right, and it's not just about buying shiny new jets. They're talking about unpopular stuff like stockpiling food, water, and energy, things that people usually ignore until there's a crisis.
It's interesting that they also mention China and Iran as threats in the region too, not just Russia, like China targeting Sweden with wolf warrior diplomacy.
Oh yeah, it's a global game now. Even North Korean missiles are apparently in range of Helsinki and Tallinn. It really puts the regional part of this into perspective.
Wait, really? North Korea? I didn't expect that.
Neither did I until I saw the map. But the core focus is definitely Russia's ability to reconstitute its military faster than NATO can fix its own gaps.
So the recommendation is basically stop being complacent. The report says public awareness has deteriorated in some countries.
Exactly. They want regular people to understand that their lifestyle might be disrupted for the sake of security. It's a tough sell in a democracy.
It really is. But seeing how Finland handled that real estate front, it makes you realize how close to home this stuff actually is.
Definitely. It's a sea change in how they think about defense, moving from just borders to the whole social fabric.
Well, that's a lot to process. That's a wild world out there. Thanks for breaking this down with me.
Anytime. It's fascinating stuff, even if it is a bit nerve-wracking.
Totally.
Chitsamuri.